Good evening and a warm welcome to each one of you. I'm Leena, convener of Research Committee 32, which is on pedagogy, teaching and learning. And we are hosting this in collaboration with RC1, which is on theory and practice in sociology. I have to thank Professor Rukmini Sen, a member managing committee Indian Sociological Society, for this extremely meaningful initiative. It was she who kind of sowed the seeds of this program. We are, of course, absolutely honored and delighted to host a session on a leading and founding figure of Indian sociology who has left an indelible mark in the knowing and making of Indian sociologies. I have never been in his classrooms, but I have engaged deeply with his writings and his ideas in my classrooms with my students and several other constituencies. They have an enormous appeal, and his writings, especially on nation, state, pluralism, citizenship, and exclusion, resonate with almost everything that one is grappling with in current times. He interrogated the hegemonic ways of knowledge making from the perspective of the privileged and entitled, and consistently argued for a sociology that is inclusive in the true sense of the term, often pointing out the gaps in early sociological knowledge with respect to those on the margins, such as the Dalits, tribals, and women. And I quote him here, where he said, while the reference to the founding fathers of Indian sociology is frequent, nobody refers to our founding mothers. Although their number was small, they were not absent, given the fact that Iravati Karve, Leela Dubey, Suma Chitnis, and others made significant contributions to the development of sociology in India. Complex histories, he always said this, could be mapped and comprehended using a perspective that combines what he called macro holism with micro individualism, often being wary of uncritical ways in which Eurocentric categories were applied in Indian context. He emphasized on a sociology that is context specific. While he remained skeptical of approaches that relied too heavily on texts and abstract theory and emphasized that it was important to engage with experiential knowledge. However, he was emphatic that it is the experiences of the marginalized that have to be centered. He drew a careful distinction between subaltern perspective and perspective from below, arguing that the perspective from below focuses on how the social structure impinges on knowledge production, something which perhaps subaltern does not do because it simply recovers voices from below. Above all, Professor Oommen saw sociology as more than just an academic discipline or an exercise. He treats it as a public discipline with a responsibility to engage with real-world issues such as development, inequality, and displacement. Sociology, in his view, should not remain confined to classrooms or journals. It should contribute to public debates and help make sense of the social transformations shaping people's lives. I don't think we can do justice to the depth and breadth of his writings and his phenomenal contributions. This is just a small attempt to celebrate his enduring legacy and his rich contributions to sociology. And we have wonderful panelists who have joined us this evening and who will, of course, talk on different aspects of Professor Women's sociologies. I welcome all of them once again. And may I now invite Dr. Suraj, convener of RC1, to take this forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Pujari, for the brief introduction. So today's panel discussion is, as mentioned, on Professor T.K. Oommen and the making of contemporary Indian sociology. We have three very important scholars who have worked, who have been taught by Professor Oommen. We have Professor Tanweer Fazal, who is associated with BML Munjal University. Professor Tanweer is a political sociologist by training, and he specializes in the study of sociology of nationalism, citizenship, nation building, discourse on rights, entitlements, with a specific emphasis on public policy. And that involves rigorous analysis of existing policy instruments and propositions of new modes of intervention. His research field has been also extended to the study of collective violence, cultures of impunity. Professor Fazal completed his undergraduate education in sociology at Aligarh Muslim University, followed by MA from JNU and doctoral degree also from JNU. He previously worked with Jamia Millia Islamia in Delhi, and he was associated with the CSSS JNU and also worked at University of Hyderabad. Our second panelist is Professor Suresh Babu, who is faculty at Zakir Husain Center for Education Studies, JNU, New Delhi. And he is also a sociologist by training. He works in the field of education, subaltern communities, developmental politics in post-colonial India. Professor Babu holds a doctorate and MPhil in sociology from CSSS JNU, New Delhi. And Professor Babu began his career at University of Jammu and subsequently serving in Zakir Husain Center. His focus has been on looking at political economy of higher education, environmental movements from subaltern perspective. And our third panelist is Dr. Gitika Day, who is faculty at Department of Sociology, Hindu College, University of Delhi. She specializes in the study of patronage politics, social movements, anthropology of policy. She holds MA and PhD in sociology from JNU. Her work also looked at factional violence in the context of Andhra Pradesh and looked at history of that region. She also works in the field of motherhood, gender, structural vulnerability, sociology of rights, and anthropology of violence. So we have three important panelists today, and we have Professor Rukmini Sen, a dean at Ambedkar University, Delhi, and she will be the discussant. So going further, I think each panelist you can take around 15 minutes, and then we can go for the discussion. Is it fine, Professor Pujari? Or we begin with Yashika's presentation?
No. I said she's a bit unwell, bit under the weather. She can't speak. Okay. So we can begin with our first panelist. Absolutely. Go ahead.
Okay.
Hi, there's some technical glitches. I'm just trying to fix it up. Right. Tanweer is ready, then he can start with.
All right. Okay.
Yeah. So I need, because there's some problem with, I think, the internet out here.
Okay. Yeah. Well, am I audible to you people?
Yes, sir. You are audible.
Okay, great. Thank you. Because I shifted to the microphone, so I just wanted to test it. Well, thank you, Suraj, and thank you all the organizers of this event. I think Professor Oommen, this is truly a great tribute to Professor Oommen and his memory, his immense contribution to the development of sociology in India. And as those who really admire his writings, those who have benefited under him, it is, of course, a special moment as well. There have been, since Professor Oommen left us, there have been, flow of, you can say, tributes, obits, etc. And all of them have been really been extremely, attentively attentive to the different, to the trajectory of his intellectual life, to actually trying to understand what was he actually trying to engage with. What were those questions which agitated him? What were those questions which, and in what situations were those questions that acquired an amount of relevance in his, or word of sociology, you can say. So in this, immense amount of writings which have emerged after the passing away of Professor Oommen, I've also been able to contribute to. One appeared in EPW recently, and the other, I think, yesterday itself appeared in Society and Culture in South Asia. Both of them actually try to, in both the ratings, are trying to engage with Professor Oommen and trying to basically understand what is Professor Oommen's sociology all about, and what is it that makes Indian intellectuals, in some sense, what are those questions which they are in different contexts they have been engaged with. If you go back to the amount of to the emergence of sociology in India, and particularly when we have scholars from University of Bombay here, one of the founding universities for sociology. In the inception phase itself, sociology, in some ways or the other, was caught in the trap of historicism. But this was also not a historicism as it is, which is, which was something which very many people have engaged with in terms of a historical sociology, but a historicism which was very abstract and which largely derived its understanding, its categories of knowledge, as well as categories of analysis, etc., from predominantly existing traditions and canonical texts. This heavy reliance on Indology or Orientalism is what, in some ways, initially, shaped the development of sociology. But in the later phase, sociology was far more empirical. As an empirical discipline, it was now more interested in understanding the social structures, but predominantly, again, it was more interested in understanding the static dimensions of Indian society, by which and that is the reason why you see village studies flourished in the 1950s and 60s. We had contributions on joint family system. We had works on caste system so much. Caste was seen as building blocks of Indian society. Women sociology, which emerged during this period, although I believe that there was this, woman was aware of the importance of villages in the Indian social makeup. But at the same time, what I think troubled him was this whole view of seeing society, particularly village societies. We went back to the original inspiration was Charles Metcalfe's idea of villages as republics in some sense. Now, Oommen was more interested in understanding village in terms of and village as well as agrarian relations in terms of its dynamism. And this probably, made him or drove him towards, studying the Bhudan Gramdan movement, which was Vinoba Bhave led. But this was primarily using Weber's idea of charisma, particularly in understanding the impact which a charismatic movement would make on prevailing social structures. But unlike Weber, who saw charisma more as a revolutionary device, as one which was which was anti-system, as one which destabilized system, Oommen's study of charisma, and particularly Vinoba Bhave's whole making of Vinoba Bhave himself as a charismatic leader, Oommen could see that the extent to which the state effort was solidly behind Vinoba Bhave. Bhave was questioned as a Gandhian. Bhave presented himself and in terms of his attire, in terms of his everyday routine engagements, etc. But at the same time, the Bhudan Gramdan movement also emerged in the backdrop of a revolutionary class struggle of the agrarian poor, led by some of the third stream left parties. So here in this case, in Bhudan Gramdan movement, Oommen actually challenges, Weber head-on, arguing that his idea of charisma is limited in the sense that though charisma could contribute to change, but this change may not necessarily be in the direction of transformative changes. It could also be a system stabilizing force. Now, what could be the motivation which drove women towards understanding this and coming to this conclusion was primarily because now women's interest in sociology developed alongside. It was the period of the 60s and the 70s. This was also a period of vibrant, social and political activism in India. The initial, we can say, legitimacy as well as the charm of the national movement had now started fading away. And there were various different kinds of grievances which had emerged collectively. The peasant movement, the students' movement, etc. And women recognized probably the demand of the context. And thus, when Professor Pujari was referring to women's insistence on contextualization, this is something it seems to be predominantly present in his entire sociological enterprise. The importance of context, how context is significant, and his, one of his books is also titled as A Plea for Contextualization. How context is what we how do we understand the context in terms of its political dynamics, in terms of its economic dynamics, in terms of what the importance of history in the making of the context itself. So context has its own dynamism too. Sometimes incessant contextualization, this is a methodological argument which I'm trying to make, incessant contextualization may lead to some sort of relativism, but probably Oommen was not necessarily pushing us towards in that direction. In Oommen's idea of context, the context had its dynamics because context was constituted of history. And history has its own, transformative capacities. Oommen, in my understanding, in the way in which I read Oommen, I would say that Oommen was one of the most radical Indian sociologists whom I would come across. Whom I have come across in some ways, and this radicalism was particularly oriented towards commitment towards, what we can say the marginals who constitute the bulk of the Indian society. Those on the margins could be defined in terms of caste, in terms of religion, in terms of gender, and so on. And Oommen sociology, we would see, in one way or the other, was very conscious of the fact that the kind of power structure which had emerged in Indian society, and its reflection in Indian sociology too, would silence these voices unless and until sociologists made a conscious decision to develop their sociology in accordance with those who were on the point of exclusion, even in the domain of knowledge production. So one of his celebrated essays is titled "Insiders and Outsiders in India: Primordial Collectivism and Cultural Pluralism in Nation Building." And here Oommen, through his very sharp and incisive analysis, questioned the exclusionary tendencies in Indian nationalist thought. Here he was taking on Indian nationalism itself and predominant ideas associated with Indian nationhood. In his understanding, the Indian nationalist thought rested on this separation between what is called the Indic and the non-Indic, or what is called the insiders and those despised as outsiders. In a similar way, he was very apprehensive of the nativist plea, to indigenize sociology and locate its sources in the classical tradition and Sanskrit texts, for instance. For him, if we, and this was a demand again, which had reappeared in the Indian sociology in the name of the debate between sociology for India, sociology in India, and etc. Oommen here came to argue that the push towards Indology would actually, end up confining the sociology to a very limited experience, the experience of the twice-born Hindus, leaving aside a large majority of Indians who are not represented in adequate manner in those classical traditions. Women's radicalism in the early 2000s, etc. The another instance was, which I can recall, when caste versus race debate emerged in India, particularly in the light of the Durban Conference, which was to be held in 2001. This was a conference against racism, but this was also a moment in which the anti-caste activists felt that it was a moment to internationalize the caste-based oppression in India, the continuation of untouchability despite its abolition by the Indian Constitution and so on. But this also left the Indian sociology divided into polarized camps, some who would argue that caste was a sociological category, whereas race was a physical category. There was no meeting point between the two. But Oommen here and his sociology was carved differently, was crafted differently. He would see that how race also over the years has emerged more as a social construct than a biological reality. And as a result, its imprints could be seen in the practice of caste, particularly the four Varna order, in which you have, racial, Varna itself means color of skin, etc. So racial features are associated with it. At the same time, we could also see historically in the growth of fascism, for example, how the race theory combined with supremacist nationalism to produce a deadly ideology, leaving massive destruction to humanity. So thus, for Oommen, this caste versus race debate was, puerile. And what he felt was, what is important was to see is that how caste itself had been, race itself had been reduced to being far more a social construct than simply a biological or physical category. And thus, this served as an intellectual arsenal to the anti-caste scholars and activists who were committed to drawing global attention towards the practice of untouchability in various forms. Oommen's, I had myself been very closely associated with Oommen in various ways. He was our teacher in the master's class. His class on thinkers and theory were, there he was, of course, at his best, very meticulous in delivering lectures and carrying the, material itself to the class. But more than that, beside being a teacher, he was a very stern disciplinarian too, and he felt that in the whole, think about training, acquiring excellence in the discipline, etc., a certain amount of commitment to time, to rigor, and all that was very, very important. I closely worked with him in the Gujarat Harmony project, as well as in the Prime Minister's high-level committee, the Sachar committee, of which he was a member. and I was a research consultant. Later on, when I joined the faculty at CSSS, Oommen was an emeritus professor and who would make occasional visits, deliver lectures, and so on. And never in my 30 years of, almost 30 years of, knowing Oommen and knowing him extremely closely as well, never would I see him having wavered on the principles that constituted his moral universe. And this moral universe was constituted of, as we have already mentioned, the commitment towards those who are on the margins, understanding a rigorous analysis of the discourses which denied them some kind of a place within the domain of knowledge itself, which denied the historical experience altogether. At the same time, Oommen was extremely committed towards the professionalization of the discipline itself. He agonized over the state of sociology in India, which despite a promising beginning had remained amateurish for him. The core periphery distinctions were very obvious and growing. Ideological infusions, clientelism, caste networks, favoritism, aided by a general apathy and state of inertia, all contributed to its increasing irrelevance. He many times lamented. But at the same time, he was not someone who would only complain, but he was also the doer. So Oommen assumed several roles in Indian sociological society itself, as one who helped edit its flagship journal, Sociological Bulletin, as a secretary of the organization, as its vice president, and later its president as well. The experience, as he wrote candidly in his one of his pieces published in Seminar, called Professionals Without Professionalism in India, he was extremely critical of the practice and the extent of professionalism, the lack of professionalism which he felt pervaded Indian sociology.
Sorry to interrupt. Tanweer sir, could you please wind up in another 2-3 minutes?
Yeah, sure. So this certainly dismayed him, but he was also not dissuaded. One of the high points in the history of Indian sociology remains the hosting of the 9th World Congress of Sociology at Delhi in 1986. It was a running success, and Oommen, as the Secretary General, was indisputably the man behind its success. And he writes, extensively about it in his autobiography. A few years later, he successfully also contested for the president of the International Sociological Association and defeated a renowned American sociologist, many of you who would have heard his name, Neil J. Smeltzer. Smeltzer was an extremely powerful figure in American sociology. Having won the election as the president, it was the prerogative of the president also to offer the various different, positions to others. Oommen, actually being a pluralist, being one who was primarily an inclusivist, approached Smeltzer to be part of the organization as a vice president or a chairperson of a committee or the other, and Smeltzer also, politely accepted it. This showed a lot about the way in which we understand professional organizations and their functions. Oommen's, election as the president of the International Sociology remains a huge achievement for Indian sociology too, as he was the first sociologist from Asia and Africa, and only the second one from the global south to have assumed the office of the president of the ISA. As I move towards conclusion, I would only argue that T.K. Oommen, one of the important works of his, which I would refer to, I'll take a minute or two more, Suraj, is From Mobilization to Institutionalization, which I would urge everyone to read. This is a work which came up this is a product of the field work which he did in 1970s, and this is the only work which derives from a field work which he conducted in his own district, home district, Aleppi, where he applies historical sociology approach as much as well as, you know, everyday ethnography to capture the contours of the peasant mobilizations in Malabar and in Aleppi. And here again, Oommen, being an iconoclast, challenged from the predominant theorists of peasant studies, such as Hamza Alvi, Eric Wolf, David Hardiman, etc. All of them who were promoting an idea of a middle peasant thesis, wherein they saw the middle peasantry, because of its capacity to hold on to a revolutionary praxis. They saw the middle peasantry as the vanguard of transformative change. But Oommen actually could recognize that the poorest of the poor, their relationship, particularly in Aleppi, the Pulayas, who were the former slaves, their relationship with the middle peasantry was contentious. And in that sense, the middle peasantry, after having benefited from the tenancy reforms, had actually turned against them. It had denounced its revolutionary potential and was more in the role of a counter-revolutionary. Some of these, reflections of these we can see in current politics too, when you see that the OBCs and the Dalits in many places have a very contentious relationship, as a result of which unity of the Bahujans is difficult to achieve, and many a times it is exploited by the right wing. I would say that Oommen's work, Oommen's contribution, his contribution to academic excellence, professionalization, intervention in public life was widely recognized. He was a recipient of all 4 awards meant for excellence in the disciplines, such as VKRV Prize, GS Ghuria Award, Swami Pranavanand Award, Lifetime Achievement Award, etc. But what really, knowing him very closely, I can see the Padma Bhushan, which he was the 3rd highest civilian award, which he was a recipient of. But what he really, knowing him very well, I would say that what he really liked was the accolades which he received from students, colleagues, and fellow professionals. And because of which, Oommen never denied or declined any invitation to share his ideas, irrespective of the fact that how small or big the platform was. I remember he would travel to far off places, in remote districts too, on the invitation of his students, former students, etc., to deliver lectures and so on. So it was not just simply that he was a globe-trotting intellectual, but one who was very, very, you can say in various ways an organic intellectual. Well, Oommen lived an intellectually fulfilling life, and he leaves a legacy of professional integrity, academic excellence, and social commitment. I would say that for Indian sociology, it is an irredeemable void. And we hope that all of us would be able to emulate some dimension and aspects of his method, of his rigor, and of his commitment to professional integrity, ethics, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Fazal, for this very interesting discussion and elaboration on different aspects and writings of Professor Oommen. Professor Suresh Babu, sir, are you ready? Yeah, now you can take it.
Suraj, am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you, Suraj. When Suraj was asking me to prepare something for this particular event, I was thought of specifically looking at Professor Oommen's writings on movement. I roughly put a title of my presentation is Assemblages of Social Movement Studies, contemplating Professor Oommen's scholarship. So in this my presentation, I would largely focus on the corpus of research Professor Oommen carried out specifically on social movements. Amidst wide range of scholarly pursuit, Professor Oommen has contributed profound sociological artifacts to conceive, develop, and theorize social movements. He was one of the pioneers in systematically and continuously engaging with the social movements as a field as well as subject matter of sociological inquiry. In fact, studying social movement, to my mind, was his own protest against the sociological orthodoxies, which are often he refused to accept it. At a time when the social structure and the hierarchies are deeply entrenched due to vertical and horizontal fragmentation of society, polity, and economy in our times, women's scholarly contribution reminds us to keep the spirit of protest and the critically informed. As a student, as a teacher, I owe to his intellectual ovary in studying the ongoing social movement, which I did also part of my PhD work, really inspired me to chart out my own intellectual journey and the sociological inquiries. Positioning and structuring social movement in the genre of sociological inquiry for knowledge production invite and motivate a generation of social scientists to build a confidence and motivate to engage with the complex apparatus of protest and change. Revisiting key academic literature on social movements, authored by Professor Oommen, as an assemblage of theory of practice, is an opportunity for contemplate our own position as an academics and citizens to be active agents of social change and social transformation. Studies on social movement involves both scientific question as well as political question because the systematic analysis is informed and persuaded by an agenda and the degree of desirability of social change. I see the studies on social movement by Oommen into three encompassing stages. The formative stage. The first stage is a formative stage. In this phase was a phase of a trial in search of a raw empiricism, leading to intensive and extensive field work to locate the properties of situation. This stage led him to lay down the foundation for developing an innovative theoretical proposition for social movement studies, namely his own masterpiece, Mobilization to Institutionalization. The second stage is an assemblage of systematic analysis on social movements and its different facets. He began to define what is social movement by explaining the characteristics of social movement as well as describing what constitutes social movement. Here he broadened the conceptual base and enlarged the landscape to build a perspective and orientation on social movement by critically deploying sociological theories, concepts, and methods. He further devises perspective from above and perspective from below as to connect the processual linkage between movement and institutions. It's very interesting to look at how he deals with these two concepts and where is the convergence of these two things, right? It's very interesting to sociologists also to look around these concepts, how he deployed, how he criticized it, and how he's trying to converge these two concepts. The third stage, perhaps he edited a volume, 2 volumes of social movement, where the third phase I see a highly matured in the sense that he offered a very comprehensive view on social movements studies by engaging with the sociologists as well as scholars from other disciplines and locations dealing with a variety of movements. The intellectual journey of an academic and as a researcher has unique combination and convergence. In Oommen's view, this I take it from his own writings, research work has a strong content of intellectual biography. This would illustrate with a couple of examples except from his own writings. Informed by his own lived experiences, Oommen reflected on an incident to explore the flexibility and the rigidity of the institutional norms which help a vulnerable student like him or make him the victims of the system. While comparing an unprecedented reception he received at Pune University when he got admission for MA Sociology and the denial of opportunity at Tata Institute of Social Sciences following a strict rule and principle from students' perspective are quite intriguing. True, the conflict between the individual interest and the institutional norms are perennial problems. Oommen was of the view that if an individual can benefit from without undermining institutional norms, there is no harm in favoring individuals. I could relate this instance with what Max Weber explained in his writings on science as vocation. Here, Weber argues that selection of an academic institution is not only based on the principles of reason and rationality that define the so-called merit. Instead, it depends on the competency of the selection committee to give a chance to the candidate with a foresight of her potential contribution in the future. This would in turn benefit both the institutions and their progress and individual growth without undermining either. Oommen's doctoral research work initiated at Rajasthan University under the supervision of Professor T.K. Unnithan, who studied on Gandhi and social change. Since Unnithan's work was not based on empirical research, Oommen was keen to undertake field-based research related to Gandhian movement. Inspiration to study the movement was because of seeing Vinoba Bhave in his native village after completing his graduation. Oommen went on to see him and listened to his speeches and words carefully. In his speech, Bhave appealed to the people of the future of India, which lies in bringing about social change in villages by distributing land to those who are working on it. As a teenager, while listening to Bhave, Oommen never thought such events become inspiration to select a topic for doctoral research after completing masters in sociology in Pune University. Meanwhile, he was offered a doctoral position to study on religion and society among the Syrian Christians of Kerala, akin to M.N. Srinivas Coorg study under the supervision of M.S.A. Rao in Delhi School of Economics. However, Oommen declined the offer. Logic of asking him to study among the Kerala Christians were to guarantee a job, he being a Christian, where he may get a job in a Christian management colleges. This Oommen sees how parochialism mixed with the professionalism based on his own experience on choosing a topic. He started his research career in the early 60s by selecting Bhudan Gramdan movement, widely known as a non-violent effort in agrarian social structure with the problem of contemporary issues on peasantry. His aspiration was to study an empirical situation to formulate a theoretical proposition. In fact, it was a doctoral research titled as Ideology and Social Change conducted in Rajasthan village, which summarizes the critical role of movement in generating social awareness on the agrarian issues. Doctoral research was a painful journey for Oommen as he began with a PhD admission in Rajasthan University under Unnithan and ended up submitting the thesis at Pune University in 1966 under the supervision of Y.B. Damle. The thesis was published with the title Charisma, Stability and Change. I am not going to details of it. Now, being grown up in a peasant family in Kerala, Oommen had a direct experience of rural life and had a direct experience of mobilization among the peasantry. After completing doctorate, he wanted to study another movement with non-violent in its orientation to assess its potentiality to bring about social transformation. His native district, Alleppey, became an excellent case for hard empirical base for studying agrarian movement and agrarian or social organization in Kerala. Alleppey had been an intensive agrarian development district which hardly affected by Green Revolution, yet known for high wage and low productivity, characterizing perpetual conflict and confrontation. Prior to receiving formal training in sociology, his exposure to the rapid social transformation in Kerala and the protracted struggles paired by multiple agencies and groups motivated him after doctoral research to sustain his field work, data collection and analysis almost for a decade in Alleppey. Close field observation and detailed accounts from the field work demystified widely held theoretical assumptions on the causal and the sequential explanation offered. Here, Oommen interprets that movements, activities, and movement participants are not confined in mobilization anymore. Instead, they are inextricably linked with the state apparatuses. Sociological studies in social movement presupposes a theory of society because collective action of people is the immediate response to crisis in the system. This would implicitly inform that there are varieties of structural deprivation and their manifestation in society at different degree and scales. It is in this context that varieties of movements were born, continue, fade, and at times reborn. Despite this particular social formation of collectivity, Oommen argues that sociological and anthropological inquiry into social movement is quite weak because of the dominant paradigm in the discipline continue to be a structural functional model preoccupied with maintaining order and integration. On the other hand, social movement studies generally concerned with conflict and change because society is always trained by continuous struggle between the forces of differentiation and disintegration and the forces of integration. And this is the typology he tried to develop to study social movements. The historical past, he says that events and historicizing particular view on the past is a resource of mobilization, but without adequately accounting the actual situation, the current circumstances, and the suffering of the subaltern masses, such studies become meaningless. A sociological literature on social movement reminds that people's struggles cannot simply be forgotten. In fact, it demands for hearing and accounting the voices of people. Questioning those who hold the power, or put it differently, speaking truth to power, is viewed with suspicion and disdain. In other words, protest has a strong component of dissent. The general disapproval of protest as a mechanism of change and the analysis of protest as a social phenomena and the potentially a factor of social change not well acknowledged in in the initial stage of sociological writings in India. To deal with this problem, Oommen carefully examines the processes involved in movement. These are the processes: the structural differentiation, the properties of situation, participant consciousness, and their role and the creative dimension to rebuild a society. Though meta-narratives of imperialism, colonialism, and nationalism were diagnostically opposed each other as a strong ideological undercurrents and contradictions, internal colonization and the hegemonic practices among the native never been subject of inquiry in the dominant narratives about history writing. Moreover, local level mobilization of the peasant communities to fight against the oppression and the discrimination in the rural social settings were aberration to such studies, including those who led sociological inquiries in the formative stage in independent India. Instead of these meta-narratives, he carefully crafted the structural conditions and the properties of situations to set the context for sociologists to locate the relevance of studying social movement. Instead of discursive regularity that defines a pattern of behavior as an object of analysis that fits well into the functional model, there are non-discursive spaces and the site that trigger non-routine active collection and collective mobilization that defines the life course of movement. There are interest, consciousness of aspirations, and the articulation of grievances in order to prepare for a collective action if they were not being judgmental on class determinants or political interest. Human capacity to creative collective action as a faith its own creation is the merit in Marx analysis that Oommen acknowledges. Given the complex nature of modern collectivism, non-traditional forms of collective action or non-class antagonistic social categories such as race, ethnic, national, feminist, youth, caste, environmental framework crystallized across the world has spillover effect. Oommen argues that this complexity cannot be addressed by existing sociological theories. Movements are pedagogical site to spark critical thinking for critical resistance and knowledge and to shape emancipatory politics, provided the conditions set by what Oommen's comprehensive framework on social movement studies. Participants have to embody reflexive commitments such as contemplation and praxis to be critical agents of change and transformation beyond the artificial creation of objective and subjective binaries. So there are certain issues which he deliberately discuss out here. To my mind, is looking at what is the right of the human rights and then how these rights are also shaping the movements. I see this right-based approaches make the movements very active, live, and meaningful. For instance, right for livelihood, right for education, right to live with dignity. Social movements in the post-colonial India are oriented with these basic premises. To elaborate further, I can bring some of the examples from his own writings. For instance, the case of agrarian mobilization, there is a micro-level orientation instead of all India so-called mobilization. There are broadly three creative actors in the agrarian mobilization based on their orientation, interest, and location. Similarly, in the case of unrest in Jharkhand and Northeast, the missionary influence led to rapid spread of education, exposure to outside world, Sanskritization to acquire tribal status equivalent to caste, clean caste Hindu, and the political consciousness. All these factors led to development of self-identity and selfhood among the tribal communities. It is this development of consciousness that triggered for the emergence of nationalistic movement among them than just exclusively attributing these movements as just a religious movements. Similarly, in the case of Dalit movement, he finds deeper problem of deprivation led by historical and oppressive structural conditions on one side and the precarity of poverty on the other side. Identity becomes a major contested site in Dalit movement as Dalit bodies and their dispositions were defined by the logic of untouchability to recover the dignity as well as define the self-respect and the selfhood. Hence, the strategies adopted to mobilization, especially among the Dalit movements, were multidimensional. And he says that they use different strategies. For instance, the reformist strategies, the legal side of it, and the political side of it, and above all, bargaining to sharing the power. So I will summarize it. Yeah, I'm going to summarize it. So this, since I have done my own research on social movements and then also studying ongoing movement is a challenge for social scientists, sociologists. Professor Oommen also addressed some of these questions. Other than the exclusive, I studied some of the youth movement, especially universities across India, as well as movement now is going on in Ladakh region. The youth participation today is complicated due to rapid transformation by diverse level of disposition such as one's own identity, something Professor Oommen also says, primordial collectivity, and the spatial location of the participant, the local, region, and the global. And then I would also add the educational credentials, aspiration for the youth, and the emerging aspirations, especially the job market, right? And above all, the active involvement in social and the digital platforms as a powerful medium for wider level of communication and coordination. So here, youth desire to participate in movement, especially the educated is, coincided with their aspiration and expectations. Therefore, the movement is not merely based on certain social location, but also new aspirations coming up, especially looking at the movement. So these aspirations also drive the movements today. So if you look at the closely observing what is going, there are new aspirations coming. These aspirations also create a condition for generating new movements, right? That's what this is one of my critique too also. So now I summarize saying that what constitutes post-colonial India is the constant resistance to the practice of orthodoxy and the restore human dignity and the equality for all through certain desirable process which underline the democratic values, democratic means, and the democratic method. Since a systematic procedure to be followed to cultivate these human traits, educating the citizens become very important and imperative. So there are technologies of mobilization. Professor Oommen talked about mobilization. I would argue there are technologies of mobilization that complicate the form of mobilization happening today, especially with the extensive usage of the social media platforms to intensify communication that actually complicate an understanding and explaining the pattern of movement of what is happening today. I will stop it here. Thank you, Suraj.
Thank you, Professor Babu. Thank you. It's a very interesting discussion. Now, Professor Gitika, you can take your time.
Yeah. Thank you, Suraj. Am I audible?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Let me begin by first thanking the organizers, Suraj, Professor Pujari, Rukmini as well, because this is an extremely significant and thoughtful exercise, I believe. So the way that I have tried to think about Professor Oommen is to locate him within the whole notion of theorizing from the global south. So the title of my discussion topic is essentially Women and Theorizing from the Global South, and I'm making some very, very preliminary observations for you all to think about essentially. So in the late 1990s, I was interviewed for the West Bengal College Service Commission, wherein in response to a question, I expressed my preference for teaching theory. Pat came the rejoinder from the panel. Given Indian sociology hasn't produced much theory, and what we teach as theory is largely being a Western import, why am I drawn to it? Both my instinctual choice and the response it evoked have been matters for rumination for me for many years now. This, of course, has also been a question that has been engaged with at different points by scholars on both sides of the divide, whether you call it East or West, North or South. This is a question which has great pedagogical import as well. We wrestle with this kind of question in our classrooms also. This is also a question that we encounter as a political dilemma, as a stark contrast between what we know as methodological nationalism versus methodological cosmopolitanism. As the audience here would know, Professor Oommen made a distinct intervention in this debate. More importantly, he was one of the sociologists who played a seminal role in constituting the very terms of this debate. The remarks I'm going to make today are meant to tease out some of the fruitful lines of thinking that emerge from his writings on theory and method in this regard. This is by no means exhaustive or fully worked out, and they must be taken, therefore, as a preliminary effort to draw attention to a possibility of harnessing the rich sociological legacy that he left for us. In other words, we are asking, what are the issues in generating concepts and theoretical formulations that speak from our specific historical and social structural realities, yet contribute to both diverse and universal sociological traditions? And how does Oommen engage in doing that through his conceptual innovations? I shall address this question by picking up 3 themes to consider for now. There could be more themes, there could be less than 3 also, but let's stick with 3 for the time being. The first theme. The first theme that I've teased out in thinking about these questions is that of problematizing the location of theory generation and constituting it as an object of inquiry. The starting point of this conversation is the distinction between what is termed as Northern theory versus Southern theory in contemporary discourse. This was not in a part of the discursive framework when Professor Oommen was writing, for instance. This distinction is variously characterized as a contrast between West or East in the lexicon of Orientalists and their critics, developed or underdeveloped, metropole or satellite, center or periphery in the language of theories of dependency and the world systems. In almost all of this dichotomous classification of the spaces of production of social theory, theory produced from Europe and North America presents itself as universal knowledge. Clearly, there is something more than mere spatial markers at work here. Southern theory is something that is occasioned by a recognition and attempts at rectification of the relations of authority, exclusion and inclusion, hegemony, partnership, sponsorship, appropriation between intellectuals and institutions in the metropole and those in the world periphery. It is perhaps more productive to think of theorizing from the global south in this light, where the process of subjecting Western categories to a different reality adds to the heft of the conceptual and theoretical formulation rather than merely challenging it in order to reject it. T. Oommen's theoretical endeavor is a testament to theorizing in this vein. In short, it is not the location of theory production, but the relations of power and the epistemological force field it generates that we need to engage with and mobilize. One of the key distinctions that could be useful in examining this process is the distinction between the context of discovery and the context of justification. The context of discovery is the actual historical and sociological processes of generating an idea or hypothesis or theory, whereas the context of justification is the process of verifying or falsifying a theory on the basis of empirical evidence. This distinction, I feel, is critical in characterizing theorizing from the global south because sociology has received theories that are mainly Eurocentric when subjected to analytical scrutiny through context-specific empirical evidence, can examine both the provincialism of the context of discovery as well as foreground theory that does emerge from the social experience of the periphery. Much before it was conceptualized in these terms, Oommen's methodological and theoretical innovations could be seen to be constitutive of how sociology was being shaped from the global south, paving the contours of a global sociology that eschews indigeneity, essentialism, and methodological nationalism in favor of contextualization and methodological cosmopolitanism, as Ulrich Beck had urged in order to transcend sociology's provincialism. In Alien Concepts and South Asian Realities, published in 1995, Oommen wrote, and I quote, "The 1960s and the 1970s articulated a virulent attack against academic colonialism in South Asia. Many rejected, or at least pretended to reject, Western concepts and theories lock, stock, and barrel. The nationalists rejected both Western and Marxian paradigms since they wanted to intertwine science with Swaraj. Thus, the rejection was not only of the social science produced in the West, but also that which did not belong to the nation. On the other hand, there were others who wanted to examine these alien concepts and theories before rejecting them, and hence their response was of a different kind. They were cosmopolitans, in that they believed that there existed an international community of social science scholars pursuing a dispassionate understanding of human society. Viewed in retrospect, I am afraid I belong to this set, even though I was not fully conscious of it at the time." Close quotes. So this is what Professor Oommen writes in 1995, Alien Concepts and South Asian Realities. Although what came to be termed as Southern theory had many different strands within it to overcome the Eurocentric biases of sociological concepts, Oommen's early pronouncements to respond and reformulate some of these received categories avoids the usually leveled charges of epistemic relativism and reverse essentialism against knowledge that seemingly originates from contexts that do not fit the West's evolutionary schema of modern and non-modern. Oommen argued, and I quote, that it is important to underline that concepts and theories, irrespective of their ideological ancestry, would meet with the same fate when subjected to empirical examination. That is, a genuine effort at concept formation and theory building lies not in rehashing what others have written, but in subjecting it to rigorous empirical test and then in reformulating it. Close quotes. Looked at in this way, Oommen's conceptual innovations were ways to read texts beyond their immediate contexts so that the texts could enter a global communication of knowledge. He clearly enunciated that, and I quote, "The linking of the discipline of sociology with the phenomenon of modernity and the institution of nation state, and by implication, the ideology of nationalism that produces it, has profound implications. One, non-modern societies will not witness the birth and flowering of sociology. Two, sociology will wither away as modernity recedes into the background and globality forges ahead." Close quotes. Which led Oommen to set out a methodological premise of legitimately speaking of sociologies of pre-modern, modern, and postmodern societies. These critical reformulations of Northern theory's classificatory premises resonate with Southern theory's indictment that time functioned in sociological thought mainly as a sign of global difference. Related with these issues is the contested notion of scientific objectivity, the gold standard, as we know, of establishing sociology's scientific credentials. Oommen had suggested that social scientists should pursue what he called particularizing objectivity, which is context-specific as against generalizing objectivity. Thus, for Oommen, we need not altogether do away with objectivity in favor of pure subjectivity. He proposed that, and I quote, "Objectivity can only mean intrasubjectivity or intersubjectivity. Intrasubjectivity obtains when an investigator gets the same result while analyzing the same phenomenon repeatedly. provided the phenomenon under investigation has not changed and the investigator holds on to the same value orientation. Intersubjectivity exists when two researchers holding similar value orientations get the same result when they study the same phenomenon at the same time. Close quotes. Thus, theorizing from the global south advocates for scientific pluralism that permits multiple objectivities rather than universal generalizable truths. Historicity of context, something that also previously Professor Fazal also mentioned, was thus the baseline in Oommen's conceptualization of the object of inquiry, from where theory is being generated. It is a plea to potentially notice puzzles, anomalies, or paradoxes in their contexts so that there is a productive conversation between the theoretical toolbox and our contexts. And I think both Professor Fazal and Professor Suraj Babu had, through instances, have actually pointed out essentially how this was done in Professor Oommen's lifelong oeuvre, for instance. Further, closely tied with issues of objectivity and methodological pluralism is the question of value orientation in research. In tandem with the general critique of theorizing from the global south, we find Oommen emphatically and consistently arguing against, I quote, the isomorphism of political and disciplinary frontiers, close quotes, as the primary mission of sociology is to study social and cultural structures in all varieties of societies. Therefore, Professor Oommen staunchly disavowed the linkage of the discipline with the nation state and instead tied the practice of sociology with, and I quote, emancipatory nationalism anchored to secularism, democracy, and humanism, close quotes. For Oommen, the conceptual decoupling of state and nation is a prerequisite for an emancipatory sociology, which also unmasks the particularistic national conceptual paradigms of European sociology, claiming universal validity and applicability. This was the first theme. This brings me to the second theme, which is, to me, the implications for theorizing from the global south. The question here is, what are we theorizing about when our contexts are markedly different from the contexts of Northern theory? Oommen posed the question thus in his essay, Sociology for One World Towards an Authentic Sociology. And the question that he posed was this: what is the authentic unit for sociological investigation? Unlike metropolitan sociology, Oommen considered society, community, nation-state, and civilization as coeval units of investigation. He argued, firstly, that in South Asian contexts, the distinction between social anthropology, studying other cultures, and sociology, which studies one's own society, is untenable and superficial. And secondly, participant observation as a method is not appropriate in South Asian societies because of the hierarchical and plural nature of these societies, leading to members of particular primordial affiliations studying their own societies. For instance, what he meant by this is that Dalits end up studying their own, that is Dalits. Women end up studying their own, that is women. Scholars who are coming from a tribal sort of primordial identity end up studying their own their own cultures, their own societies. That is what he was trying to say as one of the most important problems that we as sociologists face in contexts like our South Asian societies. Therefore, as scholars of the global south have consistently demonstrated, dichotomous constructions of human societies have been an epistemological and political trope for hegemonic Western domination. Oommen's reformulations of such dichotomous thinking is demonstrated in many of the essays contained in Alien Concepts and South Asian Realities, Knowledge and Society in India, Pluralism, Equality and Identity, to name a few. By way of illustration, Oommen proposed that, and I quote, the earlier notion of rural-urban dichotomy was replaced by that of a rural-urban continuum. However, Neither the old idea of dichotomy nor the new notion of continuum captures adequately the complex social reality of India and of South Asia, consisting of not only urban and rural peasant sectors, but also a substantial tribal sector. Therefore, I have advocated the idea of trichotomy or continuum between more than 2 points, urban, peasant, tribal, as these societies differ fundamentally in terms of their social structural features. The transformation from one type of society to another, it is argued, should be discerned in terms of the changes in their core institutional order. The core institutional order varies across different types of society. Such a proposition does not admit any kind of determinism, close quotes. Another instance where Oommen had sought to counter dichotomous characterizations of Western theoretical paradigms is in the interrelationship between mobilizations and institutionalization. Invoking the empirical experience of both Europe and India, Oommen demonstrated, and I quote, that institutions often trigger off movements and movements encapsulate within them seeds of institutions. Therefore, to juxtapose movements and institutions as mutually exclusive phenomena is to create an unnecessary wedge between concept and reality, close quotes. Challenging the classificatory systems of Western knowledge systems or epistemological dualism has been a consistent strategy in theorizing about the global South. The gamut of essays in Oommen's alien concepts, therefore, provides us with a pioneering model of practicing theorizing in this vein. The implications of theorizing from the global South then hinges on recasting Eurocentric categories in contexts that can generate factors and dynamics of theorizing. In the process, forging concepts via extrapolation, comparison of differences and similarities, as well as the delineation of boundary conditions of knowledge production. For Oommen, neither the nation state nor the state is an appropriate unit for theorizing. The former, because of its homogenizing ideals, as opposed to sociology's emphasis on exploring social and cultural diversities, the latter, because of its centralization of power and control. Oommen instead prefers a continuum of analytical units. Civilization should constitute the macro unit. National societies, not in the sense of nation states, should be the meso units. And intra-societal institutions and organizations should constitute the micro unit. In recent engagements with the issue of decolonial thought and social theory, American sociologist Julian Go had argued that a Southern standpoint does not necessarily obscure macro structures, institutions, or larger patterns of domination. And just because the starting point is localized does not mean that the analysis and theory ends up as localized. Thus, theorizing from the... I have the third theme to cover quickly, very quickly. Thus, theorizing from the global South has to reckon with academic colonialism, but as Oommen argued, the answer to academic colonialism cannot be academic nationalism, with its attendant tendencies that are antithetical to the democratic and secular spirit of the discipline. The third theme that I come to is the vexed question of the place of Southern theory in a global and connected world. Oommen's prescriptions are instructive here. His characterization of society as an event, a process, an interhuman reality that can account for the autonomy as well as the reciprocity between structure, culture, and agency at once accounts for structural continuity as well as change in understanding societies. Methodologically, true to his eclectic orientation, for Oommen, this translated into 3 precepts. 1, there is an organic relationship between the nature of the theme studied and the methods invoked, the nature and characteristics of the universe studied and the methods employed, and that no method is inherently superior or inferior, but they are contextually relevant or irrelevant. Thus, as argued in recent Southern standpoint theories, knowledge is always perspectival, yet also objective. Knowledge arises neither from pure objectivity or pure subjectivity, but from the convergence of the observer's perspective and the objective world. Oommen's methodological pluralism is based on the idea of contextualization, as others have also mentioned. That meant comparison of appropriate levels of analysis in different contexts and levels, rather than a mere cataloging of similarities and differences of cultural traits and institutional features. As Oommen's essays in alien concepts and plurality, equality, and identity, amongst others, attests, contexts help us theorize by inviting comparisons with analogous or homologous levels and units, leading to reformulations of the concepts and theories. Oommen carried out comparative studies in which he examined the applicability of concepts to a wide variety of empirical contexts, leading to reformulations of conventionally held truths. For instance, in his comparative studies on European and Indian contexts, Oommen was led to conclude that, and I quote, "the widespread belief that the advanced societies of the West are fully democratic needs to be re-examined." Close quotes. Thus, one of the ways in which theorizing from the global south can be conceptualized is the manner in which established concepts or theories are interrelated in specific contexts. Hence, it is not so much about producing generalizable concepts, but positing novel and divergent correlations, and as Oommen had emphasized, with a careful scrutiny of the historicity of context. Bringing together the three themes I have outlined above, we can discern a cogent outline of what theorizing from the global south from Professor Oommen's perspective offers. One, the route to theorizing from global south must eschew essentialism in favor of cosmopolitanism in both outlook and method. Two, in the guise of decolonizing theory, it should not regress into academic nationalism and communalism. And three, in order to contest power of Western hegemonic knowledge, we should not be tempted to embrace yet another kind of power, that of the state and the nation state. Oommen's methodological innovations are not only useful as pedagogical precepts in classrooms as spaces of decolonization, but hold significant lessons for empirically grounded research carried out with a clear understanding of the dialectic between history and theory. I'll stop here. That's all. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Professor Gitika. Yeah, so now I invite Professor Rukmini ma'am, the discussant, to take your time.
Thank you so much. First of all, to all the three panelists for such enriching papers. These were not really panel discussion thoughts. These were full-fledged seminar papers that were presented. And I really wish that in some ways we had more time to not just listen to all of you, but also to engage more closely with each of these really, really rich papers and thoughts that have been presented. I also take this opportunity to thank RC01 and RC32 for co-organizing this. So while, of course, Indian Sociological Society has held very significantly memorial meetings after Professor Oommen's passing, this really is a very important endeavor to actually hear from sociology colleagues across different higher education institutions as to how Professor Oommen's writings continue to remain relevant, continue to guide many of us in our own teaching and research, and how much there is to learn and take forward from Professor T.K. Oommen. So I don't know whether I can really call myself a discussant today, although I think Suraj and Leena insisted. But I think I will share a few reflections from hearing the three panelists, but maybe first start by just remembering being a student of Professor Oommen in his class in 1998 JNU. I did see in the people who are attending this session, Deepa, and if I'm not wrong, and if it is the same Deepa, then Deepa and I were classmates in Professor Oommen's class in 1998. And yes, sociological thinkers was what we had. Thanks, Deepa. Sociological thinkers was what we had studied from Professor Oommen. I still, maintained his notes for a very, very long time after masters. And in some ways, I don't think that I will ever forget how much one was inspired by the way he actually taught economic and philosophic manuscripts. While today there was a lot of discussion I felt about Professor Oommen's connection or conversation with Max Weber, and very rightfully so, I would feel. But in some ways, as a student, I think EPM was something that one was enamored with by hearing from being taught by Professor Oommen. After being a student of Professor Oommen, the other kind of a relationship that I enjoyed with him was when I was teaching at the National Law University in Calcutta, and Professor Oommen was our academic council member of NUJS. And I had to teach law to sociology students. And very interestingly, one of the first books that I came across was Professor T.K. Oommen and Professor C.K. Venugopal's Law for Sociology Students. And, very interestingly, he comes back in a very different way. And I remember one particular conversation with him when he had attended an AC meeting about why is it important for law students to study sociology? How is it that as a sociology teacher, one can teach social movements, citizenship, and pluralism to law students? And I would think that maybe in some ways one has tried to do that while teaching law students, and also building up over the years, my own teaching and research specialization around sociology of law. What we heard today were three very distinct and very important papers, all of which, while they are distinct, yet there are clearly certain conversations that each of them were having between each other. And I would definitely think that one of the key things for us to engage with is the importance of context. I think that is something which came through definitely in Professor Fazal's, Professor Suresh Babu, and also Professor Gitika Dey's presentation, the importance of context. And in some ways, one would think that the way in which context is happening is changing in the three different iterations, but at the same point of time, contextualization and methodological cosmopolitanism that Gitika mentioned, or what Professor Suresh Babu talks about in terms of understanding the importance of context when we engage, when we do a sociological inquiry into social movement studies. So either specifically or pedagogically or definitely empirically, context becomes an important concept in Professor Oommen's legacy and thought. If that is number one, the second is very clearly the understanding, again, with respect to plurality. And I think that, to me, is quite interesting, that while we are engaging with context, context is not something that is homogenized. Rather, context remains very local, very specific, which leads to questions of pluralism. So how is it that questions of pluralism juxtapose universal principles? That is something which I would feel has, again, come through. Definitely one would think, when Professor Gitika was talking about thoughts from the global south, one definitely felt that questions of pluralism was very, very significantly foregrounded, and very interestingly, questions of pluralism in correlation with what she said, particularizing objectivity. And it's also very interesting that how Professor Oommen is not is not giving up in any way on questions of objectivity, rather complicating it and making it more complex. And as Gitika said, that particularizing objectivity meant intrasubjectivity and intersubjectivity. So how is it that these become important tools through which we engage with our specific empirical context? I think is something which, again, a second thing that came through all the discussions. A third thing that comes through in all the discussions is very clearly Professor Oommen's engagement with questions of exclusion. Questions of exclusion, questions of identity, questions of citizenship. While I don't think that maybe citizenship as a concept was something which was coming through in today's discussion, but very naturally it would actually lead to questions of citizenship, which again is a big area that Professor Oommen definitely writes about. And I think as students and practitioners of sociology, what is actually so important is how is it that Professor Oommen just not theoretically engages with questions of exclusion and citizenship, but also engages with it through his own engagement with at least the two things that Professor Tanweer Fazal talked about, the Gujarat Harmony Project and being part of the Sachar Committee. And very interestingly, while we have never really kind of identified Professor T.K. Oommen as a public sociologist, I was very intrigued, I think, when Tanweer said, one of the panelists said, how radical Professor T.K. Oommen was in his writing, in his research, as well as in his teaching. Without really making a lot of publicity around it. And to a large extent, I think that for many of us today, that is something which is extremely noteworthy, something to learn and something to also cherish. So I would think that that's the third stream of thought that came through each of the engagements today. The final thought that I would, a final, strain of thinking that comes is while social movements is a very specific engagement that Professor Oommen is doing, and there is a lot of writing that he's doing around movements, very clearly from his original PhD work, engaging with Bhudan movement. And I was very recently reading a piece that Rennie Thomas has written in honor of Professor Oommen in The Wire. And Rennie actually writes that Professor Oommen, in an interview with Professor Susan Vishwanathan, had actually said that he would probably have done his PhD with Iravati Karve, but accidentally ended up doing it with Professor Damle. And, since reading that, I have been thinking that what course would Professor Oommen have taken if he had actually done a PhD with Professor Iravati Karve. But having said that, I would actually want to think that while maybe social movement very clearly was one specific engagement that Professor Oommen did consistently throughout, his entire teaching and writing life. It's probably important for us to also understand how is it that today, when we are rethinking sociology curriculum, syllabi, etc., in a larger landscape where protest, movement, questions of transformation are being questioned, what is it that we have to learn from Professor Oommen's contribution to social movements? And I do feel that while, clearly there is a way in which we can trace a genealogy in Professor Oommen's work itself on social movement studies, But I would also think that the point where Professor Suresh Babu ended about engaging with questions of youth movement that he himself has studied and bringing in the concept of aspiration, and in some ways, if I may, talking back or talking with Professor Oommen's understanding and contribution to social movement, that becomes an important space for us to also think about as to how is it that when we today do movement studies, how do we engage with Professor Oommen's contribution to social movements? And I do want to talk about the fact that my own engagement with the question of women's movements in India, in some ways is so intrinsically informed with the three strategies or principles that Professor Suresh Babu talked about, which he sees in Professor Oommen's writing, whether is it reformist, is it legal, and what are the kinds of bargaining capacities that a movement did. And it's actually quite interesting that women's movement in India has been critiqued to be reformist, has also been thought about as a space which has given a lot of legal transformation. And over a period of time, one is actually wondering whether the bargaining capacity with the state has lessened over a period of time with respect to women's movement today. The last thing that I would want to say is, from movements to studying professions, Professor Oommen has, done that journey as well. He's one of the earliest sociologists who also studied, nurses, lawyers, doctors. Sociology of professions is not really something that we engage with very significantly. And it is actually quite interesting to note that he has studied professions and he has studied social movements as well. And that, in some senses, I was feeling is so correlated to something that Gitika said towards the end, which is that in Oommen's writing, you are really not seeing movements, the study of movements and the study of institutions as a binary. That is not something that we are seeing. Rather, the fact that there is a messy conversation between the two is something which is quite obvious, and that is something that I do think Professor Oommen's work give us very significantly. With these words, I definitely would want to say that all of us here, sociologists, teachers, researchers, scholars, there is a need to relook at many of these very eminent sociological thinkers who are actually tracing and writing about India. About India in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s. And today, where we stand and where sociology in India stands, it is really important that we go back and relook these and understand the importance of what sociologists in India have contributed to the understanding of the plural society of India, but also to be a voice from this part of the world. Before ending, I would like to acknowledge a really, really significant work that went behind before we started this panel discussion. And we had a student, Yashika, who very importantly had done a review of literature of the kind of publications that we see of Professor T.K. Oommen in the ISS journal, Indian Sociological Bulletin. And Yashika, I think, is here in the meeting, but she's not well enough to talk about what she's done. But I really want to acknowledge, the way in which she has brought out some of the important threads that we see in Professor Oommen's contribution to Sociological Bulletin, where we see, of course, his engagement with theory and concept. We see his engagement with questions of pedagogy, and we also see his engagement with questions of civil society and citizenship. Those of you who are interested, hi Yashika, those of you who
Thank you very much, ma'am. Yeah.
Those of you who are interested, you may write to us and we may share this review with Yashika's permission to people, so that you can also have a look at this vast landscape from 1995 to 2023 that Professor T.K. Oommen have written in the Sociological Bulletin. Thank you very much to Leena and Suraj for giving me this opportunity to engage with such rich discussions that we had today.
I think thank you to each one of you. I mean, as you rightly said, Rukmini, these were full-fledged papers, very rich discussions, and one can read the comments here of it felt as though T.K. Oommen was right here and we were listening to his conversation, and that became possible because of all of you, 4 of you, significant takeaways, I think, for our students and research scholars who are here on this platform. In case our panelists would like to take some questions, and if the participants have some questions, please feel free to unmute and ask, or probably you can put it in the chat box and we can then, our panelists can then respond to it.